Board refreshment has become one of the defining governance challenges facing public company directors. But the conversation is increasingly moving beyond optics and toward strategy, skills, and long term effectiveness. As companies confront rapid technological change, evolving risk landscapes, and shifting investor expectations, boards are being forced to rethink not only who belongs in the boardroom, but how directors are evaluated, onboarded, and developed. In our next discussion with Hollie Castro, director of Group Dynamite, we explore what effective board refreshment really looks like and how boards can align composition and governance practices with the future of the business. Hollie, your article for Directors and Boards argues that board refreshment should start with strategy, not demographics or optics. When a board evaluates its composition, how should it translate the company's forward strategy into specific director capabilities? And what tools or frameworks have you seen work best in accomplishing that?
Yes. So I think this is really, really important, and it's becoming even more important as we move forward, sort of in the new age of AI and technology advancements. So the question that I start with is, where are we actually going in the next 3 to 5 years? How are we defining future state beyond the financials, which includes your operating model and your culture? What are we becoming? And what are the kind of attributes that will help that operating model and culture flourish as a board? How do we translate strategy into specific capabilities, not just generic experience, but specific capabilities? So the example that I give is, like, if you're thinking about digital transformation, leaders who have actually scaled through change, managed resistance, led people through it, leaders that are familiar with what will be the largest workforce ever between millennial and Gen Z. They will represent 75% of the world's workforce in less than 4 years. So has this board member actually worked in those kinds of situations? How they, or are we using a strategy linked capability matrix? This is really important because this isn't a static checklist. Rather, it's an actual matrix that you're looking at against your strategy. And then, have we mapped current board versus future board needs and identified real gaps? Framing it always as an evolving board and not replacing individuals, but as a common practice that we're using as we evolve the board each year.
And you've written, our audience should know, you've written about the multi-generational workforce for directors and boards as well. So not only checking out this article on board refreshment, but also check out that article as well. It's great stuff. And so boards are often reluctant to evaluate sitting directors against evolving needs. What have you seen work in practice when a board needs to have difficult conversations about whether a director's skills still align with where the company's going?
Yes, this is very difficult. I understand this. And I think the first thing that is really important is to normalize the evaluation as an ongoing process. If it is normalized as an ongoing process and not a one-time event, then it's a much more sort of natural and less individualistic conversation and just part of the process that you're managing your board off of. Anchoring everything in the business needs and not personal performance. I think, as sort of an anchor or a tenant, that is an important sort of strategy to think about. Setting expectations early, and that absolutely makes future conversations easier. When you shift the tone from personal to purposeful, it's very important. So the purpose of the conversation versus an attack on the individual, or what could feel like an attack on the individual. And then high trust boards make this very forward looking, not a reaction to something that happened in one board meeting. And then the last thing I would say on this is that the reality is, really strong directors usually already know when there's a misalignment. So though it may be conveyed as a surprise, typically, if they're strong directors, they know there's misalignment.
It's interesting because there's never really a surprise, right? You're kind of documenting things as you go along, and as you said, if you're in a board and you sort of get the feeling that your statements aren't carrying the same weight, things like that. So in a way, there's really no surprises. And
Right.
so your piece, it also notes that traditional onboarding, such as briefings, site visits, compliance materials, they rarely accelerate governance effectiveness. Now, what are the most effective ways you've seen boards help new directors contribute meaningfully within their first year, let's say?
So traditional onboarding, is sort of information, not context. And I think, and this applies also to executive teams, but for boards, the context is super important. And so I think focusing on an intentional immersion, not just a briefing, is a really important concept and mindset for the board to have. What does this mean? So it means prioritizing direct exposure of the board member beyond the C-suite. So not just to the C-suite, but beyond the C-suite. Conversations across all levels of the organization, and for the board member to really immerse themselves in that. And really getting an insight into the culture, not just the strategy decks. Helping new directors understand how the company actually operates. I mean, we all come with our perspectives and our experiences, but those may or may not be identical to how that company operates. And then why the decisions get made the way they do, understanding the why behind the decision, and then pairing that immersion with really clear expectations on where they can add value. And ultimately, your goal is to accelerate the authentic contribution of the board member, not just to have them participate.
And so we talk in our final question here. There's the old argument of the generalist versus specialist sort of deal, right? There's a natural tension in bringing in new expertise, whether that be AI, cybersecurity, workforce change, and preserving the pattern recognition that experienced directors bring. So, how should boards intentionally structure that balance rather than letting it happen by accident?
So you just said it. I think this is actually really important. This balance needs to be designed. It needs to not be left to chance. As you think about AI in particular, this isn't a singular person's responsibility. It's affecting everyone in the workforce and in companies. So experienced directors bring judgment and pattern recognition. The new expertise really brings relevance around a very rapidly changing environment. And I think that blend and that intentional design of the blend is really, really important. I think it's really important to avoid tokenism. We need one tech person. We need an AI person because that's the person who's going to be responsible to ask all the AI questions in the board meeting. That's actually the responsibility of every board. Focusing on the integration of the perspectives and not just the representation of a single discipline. And then really, really thoughtfully creating space for very different voices to influence decisions, to ask questions about decisions, to provide a contrarian point of view in a respectful way. But the best boards are really boards that challenge perspectives and challenge each other and allow those challenges to strengthen them, strengthen the board itself.